just about everybody on this department has heard me talk about, yep, you know, this is a difficult job. Policing is a difficult job. It always will be. I don't think, certainly in my lifetime, and perhaps never, that we'll ever get to the point where there isn't going to be the, you know, use of force in policing. I mean, because we work in an adversarial thing, and sometimes we deal with evil. But recognizing that, it's still also that is the minority. I mean, the amount that we deal with evil and confront evil, that's a small part in that. Most of the time, we're having contact with good people who maybe just aren't having the best day. And maybe not having the best day means they did commit a crime or do something, but that in and of themselves doesn't make them a bad person. And you know, what I try to teach our officers, or I tell them when they come on, is it's like, think about how you would want a loved one, a parent, a brother, a sister, a child, to be treated when they were having one of those bad days themselves. And use that to guide how you respond to our public. The fact of the matter is, you know, and maybe this is a little simplistic, but I mean, I tell our new officers that every time they have contact with the public, opportunity to advance our profession in a positive way, to leave people with a positive impression of law enforcement, not only the profession as a whole, but as our superior police department, and then down to you as the individual person wearing a uniform. That every contact with the public, you have that opportunity. And the thing is you can do a traffic stop, and you can even choose to write the citation because maybe that's the right thing to do. Mm-hmm. And you can do that in a way that still leaves a favorable impression on the person. Or you can do it in a way that's condescending, rude, comes across as you being kind of a power-hungry authoritarian. You know, but every contact there is that opportunity to have a positive impression. I mean, I can't tell you the number of times that I've arrested people, brought them to jail, and I mean, they're like, hey, you know, you did your job, and I appreciate you treating me with dignity and respect. I mean,
nice.
You know, and that's how most people will be if they felt like they've been treated properly, even when they've done something wrong.
Yeah.
It's when you've done something wrong and then you're belittled for it on top of it. I've released, I don't know, 5 or 6 officers in the last 5 years during probation that there were just what I call red flags during their first year here that you know, and the way I look at it is that for your first year here, I should be seeing you on your best behavior.
Right.
And if I'm seeing red flags now when you're on your best behavior, what am I going to see once you no longer have this threat of or potential of termination hanging over your head? And I released one officer for basically being rude and condescending to the passengers of a vehicle on a traffic stop, and it turned out they were all African American females in the car. But I looked at the way that officer verbally spoke to them and was condescending and rude, and I said to myself, it's like, I'd never be comfortable the rest of my career here going home at night knowing that I had an officer out there that was treating people like that.
Right. Do they ever reapply? Have you seen that, those that you've released?
I have had one of the people that I've released has reapplied.
Okay.
They have not ever been retired. That does pose a great question, though, you know, when we're talking nationally in terms of law enforcement. That's a problem in policing, that bad actors, sometimes the information isn't memorialized in a way that when they go apply somewhere else, that department immediately knows, hey,
okay,
this guy was a bad apple here, why would we even want to hire him? You know, where that, you know, in some of the discussions of reforming law enforcement, that's one of the topics that they talk about, is having like a national database or registry for law enforcement, so when somebody is dismissed for cause, that all future employers will be able to see that and find out about it. You know, to prevent, you know, a bad cop moving from one jurisdiction to the next.
Right.
And finally ending when something horrible happens. Wisconsin does have it within our state.
Okay.
It'd be very difficult in the state of Wisconsin for somebody who's a really bad cop and dismissed for cause in one agency to get hired in another agency in Wisconsin. That's something that's really kind of been implemented in the last few years. But, you know, it's pretty easy now to find out, at least within our state, why somebody no longer works for a department. You know, and there are, you know, there are cases where some people don't clear their probation, not because they're a bad person, or that they lack character or any of the good qualities, but some of them just don't respond to the training, or some of the skills that are necessary. So, you know, policing a lot of times what they refer to as skills are things like use of a firearm, use of defensive and arrest tactics, driving a police vehicle. Those are skills. And I typically, when I look at the hiring process, I'm not too concerned about those things. I'm more concerned about their emotional intelligence, compassion, empathy, you know, their character, with the idea that those are things that I really have a hard time training. You know,
Yeah.
Somebody who doesn't have honesty, integrity, and empathy and compassion, those are very difficult things to train and make a person have. I do believe we can influence empathy and compassion, you know, by reinforcing, you know, through trainings and different outcomes in the department, you know, that helps. I like to call it, you know, empathy or compassion building training, you know, but I don't think you can make somebody have it that doesn't already at least possess the capability of it.
Right.
Where most of the time I feel like we can train most people to drive the squad car, to learn how to arrest somebody, to use a firearm. Occasionally, you get somebody who's got all of the soft skills here, and then when it comes to those concrete skills in policing, that they're just not that good at. And I've seen people who have not made it through our department, you know, and whether they needed to mature a little bit more or you know, reset the clock and try again to get good at where they've gone off and been successful somewhere else.
Okay.
But they didn't lose their job because they were a bad apple. They just lost it because they weren't quite, you know, meeting our standards.
Okay.
You know, there's a difference there, I think, too.
Yeah.
That change doesn't happen overnight, and again, as I mentioned, we're not a perfect department. We have our problems too, and we have our areas to improve. But part of that too is because it does take time. I might be able to win over the hearts of some existing members, you know, to buy into my mission and vision for law enforcement and how we're supposed to be. And some, I may never be able to do that. So in some cases, it might mean that it'll change when those people retire.
Okay.
But I can also make sure that every new person that I hire, that I definitely feel, you know, where I can have some strong confidence that they possess the characters and the qualities that I want that are going to help us advance our mission, you know. So because of the dynamic, though, it does take time. It doesn't happen overnight.
Place up north that is pro-pollinator. I mean, this is a bunch of old hippies out here in Little Carlton.
Right, so I'm saying to the kids,
I guess it fits.
you
what
know,
you're saying.
I think you would have much more willing pairs of ears found in the city council of this little tiny town than you would to the members of your school board. Because they were talking about going to the school board. Well, the principal said, I don't care if you go to the school board or not. I'm signing off and I'm saying this is all good. This is what you guys should be doing, right?
Okay.
So you don't need any higher sanction than
Because
my
the
approval.
school board has a couple people on it who are,
Duds.
could have been the swastika people practically.
Right,
Really?
yeah. So,
Well, yeah. I
These
mean,
kids
it's
are
both
also-
things here. I would say that in Carlton County, or in Carlton, the little tiny county seat of Carlton County is progressive, but you get out very far, Cloquet just isn't. You know, Cloquet has a lot more of the bigotry stuff that you hear about in rural white America. And, you know, they're not at all respectful to the Native community, and, you know, it's just a different deal. But Little Carlton is like Groove City.
I mean, I'll be the first to admit, I've had a relatively privileged life. I mean, I've grown up in a good family, middle class, you know, Caucasian. I guess, I'm Greek, but other than people commenting that, you know, I get a nice tan, I mean, nothing really has negatively been there. I guess the one thing that comes to mind, and again, this is because of the product of who I am and what I do. I even, you know, I said it I went to a UWS thing and I spoke one day and I went in a suit. You know, and during that talk I mentioned that if I had come in my uniform today, people immediately would have judged me differently than me up here talking to you today in a suit. You know, so I do think, you know, that prejudice is tough, but certainly I think some stereotypes are applied to me as a police officer that may not be reflective of who I am. You know, there's well-documented studies, you know, in American policing, you know, that have, you know, look at that, you know, maybe an officer doesn't know when he initiates a stop, the color or, you know, anything about the person that they're driving, but once they do make that stop, our people of color asked to have a consensual search of their car more than, you know, say a white person. You know, and just there, I think everybody has, I don't think fear is the right word, because I think for a lot of people of color, it's a fear. For the rest of the public, I mean, maybe it's an anxiety if a squad car's behind them, like, oh shit, am I doing something wrong? Am I speeding? Did I come to a complete stop? But your average person isn't worried that their safety could be in jeopardy.
Do you feel minorities are treated as equal to whites? Just kind of looking at the Twin Ports area, the state of Minnesota, and then U.S., do you think that answer would differ with those three locations?
Well, to me, I would say yes, I hope so. But then hearing stories from black people that I know and I trust they're people of integrity, they're not lying to me.
Mm-hmm.
They don't feel like they're being treated the same. You know, they get ID'd when nobody else is getting ID'd, they get stopped. And so those are the kind of things that happen to them that I don't know about. So in my mind, I would say my experiences from, without talking to them, I'd say, well, yeah, of course, everybody's treated fairly. Everybody's equal here. But then when you hear their stories, it's like, how can that be happening here? You know, so it could be worse here because, like you said, there's fewer blacks here. I think it's less than 10%. Do you know what the ratio is?
No, I do not.
I think in Duluth it's 10% or less. And so check out that fact. I'm not sure if that's true or not. But so I think in Minneapolis there might be a larger percentage in certain areas that then they're probably treated more fairly. Maybe people are more used to it. You know.
Our state citations, and I know you had some questions about Indigenous people there, but on our state citation book it says, you know, they have a legend on the front, and you know, there's one column for race, and there's, you know, W for white, P for black, A for Asian, H for Hispanic, I for Indian, and when we were compiling stats for that a committee asked for the data that was pulled from the state, those are the abbreviations in code that they provided. And I remember initially looking at the I in /Indian thinking, geez, you know, I would have thought it was Native American, but then I find out that, you know, Native American actually to many Native Americans, what I associate the term Native American with, indigenous people would either be called indigenous people or American Indian. And that just the term Indian is, highly offensive.
Yes.
The other thing that during impartial training we went through, one of the teaching points for them too is like, take a second before you're about to do something in your role as a police officer and ask yourself, would I be doing this except for that the person is? And if you answer yes, there's a problem, you need to rethink what you're doing. Would I be doing this if the person wasn't black? And if the answer there is no, then, it's just these little litmus tests that you have to kind of do to check yourself sometimes. Committed to justice, this is where I think most people, where I go down a little different path than what they're expecting. I mean, I know that lots of people think of lady justice and the scales of justice, enforcing laws, arresting people, and so on when we use that word justice, but I like to talk about the root word of justice being just, which is to do what's right. And what I explained to all the new officers is that I'm more interested in them seeking better outcomes. And maybe the better outcome does mean that we have to arrest somebody or enforce a law, but that there's also other avenues, and it kind of goes on the idea that the police service got a lot of authority. I mean, we have a tremendous amount of discretion in our official capacity, and to use that discretion with the overall goal of trying to find the best outcomes, that's where I want to see the department go. And I kind of talk about we have the letter of the law and we have the spirit of the law. You got to call out bad things when you see them, and not hide behind them either. Anytime that I see a law enforcement officer, tarnishing the badge, misrepresenting this profession, doing something blatantly outright wrong, excessive use of force, whatnot, it's like, I'm not going to condone that. I mean, I've worked hard to, have a good reputation in this profession and to try to do what's right, and I'm not going to support just under the color of our uniform or the badge we wear that somehow treating people wrong is okay. I can think as a young officer, and I've obviously matured over the years, but I mean, as a young officer, there was probably a time or a call that I'd been on where somebody was in poverty, and maybe in the back of my head, my thought would be, why don't they just go get a job? There's lots of jobs out there. But the fact of the matter is when you're living in poverty, it's not that simple of an answer. It's a much more complex problem. They're dealing with children and daycare and navigating the the services that are available out there. I mean, there's a lot of it's not that easy a system. They have transportation issues. They don't have a car. There are a lot of things that go into when you think about somebody who's living in poverty. It's not the simple answer, just get a job. It's not that simple. It's a complex thing, and by immersing your staff into a training like that where they get a little better understanding of what it's like to be living in that set of circumstances, hopefully shapes the way that they respond to those calls in the future. That simple answer to that complex problem just isn't how it works. When we look in Duluth over in Chester Bowl a year and a half ago, the most dangerous time in a domestic relationship is when the victim chooses to leave. That's what happened there. The young woman told her husband she was going to leave and take the kids, and it resulted in him killing her. And I think when you take that into consideration, when you have that perspective going into some of those calls, not only do I think it's going to make you more compassionate and empathetic toward the victim, but just probably be able to just do a better job at helping them navigate, what's going to happen moving forward.
Okay.
We have some people from our church that actually are professional people, but are black, and they've talked about how they've been ID'd, at the University of Minnesota, nobody else gets ID'd, they get stopped. Why are you here? Do you have a purpose to be here? Can I see your ID? And going through the cashier line, it's like, you know, let's say a white person after white person, nobody gets asked, but they get up there to charge something, and then they say, "Can I see your ID, please?" So all of those things have happened and really taught me that there's prejudices going on that we don't experience. And, you know, it's one thing that we can say, well, if they would only acted differently, then the police would do it. But when they're innocent and people have this, they take prejudicial actions because of the color of the skin, then it's like something's not right.
But the one thing that does bother me is that, you know, in the end, we're all humans, and humans are flawed and make mistakes, and, you know, we're not, it feels like sometimes with, you know, when we're talking about the media and so on, that, you know, that the expectation is that we're gonna be perfect all the time. And, you know, that's just a unrealistic standard.
Yeah, I agree.
We need to be as close to it as we can be, but we never will be perfect because we're human and we make mistakes. You know, the difference is you know, making a good faith mistake and making overt, you know, intentional.
When I moved up here, there was just, and then it had, I don't think it had anything to do with Duluth, just had to do with my own education. I started watching more movies and documentaries about the civil rights movement.
Okay.
And so it blew my mind, because even though I was raised studying those things in high school, taking all the quizzes, taking all the tests, and I had to be average, so I was a decent student. So I had to pass all those quizzes, all the tests of all the civil rights movements, all the different things going on. None of it really hit me as being whatever. I just thought, okay, I have to know this. But once I came up here, and Ann and I moved up here, and we started watching these movies like Mississippi Burning and some of the movies through the years that have actually portrayed true life events that happened down in the South,
Right.
not that long ago, it just began to blow my mind.
I have noticed, you know, kind of going back to that, Native American versus American Indian,
Yeah.
Indigenous.
Yeah, you know, I did some research on it, and, you know, because the person who brought it to my attention was an American Indian, that actually, you know, from Alaska, so it was Inuit.
Okay.
Another, even more desirable is if you know a particular tribe,
Yes.
you know, or then you identify them, you know, that way. But, yeah, I mean, I definitely, initially when I saw the I in Indian, I was like, that just doesn't, you know, something's not right there. I mean, I recognized that, but then I was a little, then I did my research and I saw that actually Native American isn't the desired one. That's, you know, threw me off a little bit.
Yeah.
But, you know, that's, you know, you gotta be open to learning, you know, many of the things that I mentioned to you today, it's like, I didn't learn these things till, you know, later in life, and how to, you know, now that I have learned them, you know, it gives me a little bit different outlook and perspective on, you know, things than I would have had before.
Kids are going like, we got this going on in the school, we want to explore that. We want to understand Black Lives Matter and that movement, because we feel connected, even though they're disconnected from it, because there's not much of a black community up here. There is the Native community, which is far more, you know, in your face, or a part of their environment, right? And yet, because of all the publicity and all of what has been the focal point, as well as this particular movement gaining so much widespread support across all groups of people, that they want to be engaged. How do we engage as white, rural
Kids.
youth authentically in the Black Lives Matter and host that discourse or with our parents or within our community and stuff.
Mhm.
I view one of the bigger things that I can do as a chief, for this agency, as the head of this agency, is to influence the culture of the department. And that's something that, law enforcement has needed to change. I mean, the culture that existed, in law enforcement over the years, it certainly has changed over time, but there's a lot of aspects of it that don't, serve our communities the way that we should now. So we do have to shift that. And I look at, in my role as chief, is, trying to be able to influence that culture and move it in a direction that I think is, a better one. And Pathways to Hope, that's one way that I help shape the culture of this department. I mean, I tell my officers that under the right set of circumstances, times when you would normally arrested people, we're going to put them in treatment and we're going to pay for it. That's a significant cultural shift over what police have done in the past. I talked to you about empathy. That I think that's a very important quality. I often get asked what's the most important quality of a police officer when I, out in the public or speaking to classes, and people think that I'm going to say, honesty, integrity, courage, all great qualities. In fact, I assume that anybody that I'm going to hire has that. But what I really am looking for is the quality of their character and their ability to have empathy and compassion for people and to treat everybody fairly and equally. And I try to build some of those things into the training curriculums that I bring to the department. I've brought in some different ones over the years. And I'm sure not every officer is probably receptive to them, or it may not have the impact on them that I hoped for, but I've brought in poverty simulation training where the fact is, police departments, it's not just here in Superior, but I think nationally, we spend more of our police resources in communities and neighborhoods that are less affluent and they're in lower income or below the poverty line. And I think it's important for officers to have at least a basic understanding of what living in that environment is like to be able to use their discretion appropriately. For the department, I brought fair and impartial policing with a strong emphasis on recognizing our biases. We all have biases, particularly your unconscious or implicit biases, and becoming aware of them and having some strategies to deal with it so that they don't, influence your decision-making process, so you don't let that be the reason. And I think in law enforcement, with all of the discretion that we have, that's very important. Understanding what our biases are and taking steps to make sure that we're not making decisions just based off of that. Along with that training comes a lot of professional communications and de-escalation strategies. Okay. And those are all types of things that that we've brought in here that I hope, when I talk about us, being a very good department, but always, seeking opportunities to improve, those are a few examples of it. And it kind of goes along this whole larger concept too. So, I mean, I'm a product of, you probably didn't expect me to say anything terribly negative about policing because, I'm a product of this system. I mean, that's where my career's been, and but I also, I've grown to appreciate, especially, more in my older years, that when I was growing up in the department, our primary training was, driving the squad cars, emergency vehicle operations, and firearms, and defensive and arrest tactics. Those are skills that every officer needs to have, but those are skills that we use the least. We use communications and try to do, verbal de-escalation and to calm situations down more often. I mean, so why don't we dedicate as much or more time to the things that we do more frequently? Instead of just training to shoot at a target.
Is that something that you really made the push for here with your department, or?
I think Chief before me started in that direction, and I've just taken it and,
Okay.
even pushed it further, where I'm bringing in some different trainings that, we haven't experienced in the past, and some of them I think are ones that need to be, like, Firearms is something that the state says that we have to do multiple times a year to be proficient, to maintain that proficiency. And I think of like fair and impartial policing and working on our biases. We need to equally continue to train them. I can't just bring in one training one year and say, hey, we've had this, training on bias and we're all good.
Okay.
No, we need to practice it. It needs to be work repetitions. It needs to be training that we bring back and refresh on and constantly retrain to one, build, and two, maintain those proficiencies. Up in the department, our annual evaluations focused primarily on the number of arrests that we made and the number of tickets that we wrote. I mean, those were the key benchmarks. And, me as chief, that was one of the first things we did. We did revamp our employee evaluation process, and we put greater emphasis on community policing and positive interactions with the public versus arrests and traffic stops. Now, officers still need to be doing some traffic enforcement and stopping vehicles and making arrests when appropriate, but I've always been of the mindset that if our evals are only focusing on the arrests and traffic, most of our employees want to get a good eval. So what are they going to do? They're going to see what we value, what we choose to evaluate you on, and that's what they're going to do best at. So they'll make a lot of arrests and they'll make a lot of traffic tickets. But what about all those chances and opportunities for community policing and positive interaction? I mean, we talked about that for many years, but we never really incorporated it into our evaluation process. So were we sending the message to the department, yeah, that's lip service, but these are the things that you still need to be really good at to get a good eval? So, we changed that where, our community policing and community interaction is, weighted equally to those enforcement activities.
Nobody is capable of sustaining one's self.
How does religion or spirituality factor in the improvement of the American society?
Well, I hope that being Christian would help people to understand God loves everybody and everybody should be equal. I mean, if they study the New Testament, that's the preaching or teaching of the New Testament, that there's neither male nor female nor Greek nor Jew or black or white, or there's no race. We're all equal. They say the ground at the cross is equal, so is level ground. So you hope Christianity will continue to help. I think it was Christians that actually led the anti-slavery movement, some very bold Christians, because then there were some Christians that said, well, no, the Bible never speaks against it, so we should continue having slaves. And so, so back then, and sad to say, even in the down south during the civil rights movement, there were Christians that totally went forward with the segregation, and they didn't want to integrate their churches. They didn't want to integrate schools, even though they were Christians. So like Billy Graham's been a hero of mine. But one of the things he did is that when he had crusades in those stadiums, when they wanted to divide up white sections and black sections, he said no. He said they're all going to be together. And there were white churches that wouldn't even work with the crusades because they said, well, no, we're not. If you want to mix the blacks and the whites together, we're not going to be part of that. So, and thank God for civil rights leaders, Martin Luther King Jr., how he spoke out, and the Christians that were part of that civil rights movement trying to change people's thoughts and acceptance. So you hope the question about Christian values, you hope it helps.
Kind of a heavy subject
It
to
is,
kind of
yeah.
dive into. It's, personally I've heard, at church where, God's looking at your motives, your actions, of course, looking at the heart of the matter, and then you've got people who just see what you physically do, they hear what you say, and it's, sometimes you get to judging yourself on their behalf and to, well, if I don't do this thing that I'm used to doing or they're accustomed to me doing, they're going to see me as this, or perhaps I'm just going to fall short somehow.
I'll be, I've got some, concerns with some of the religious, the institution of religion, in the sense that, our society has changed, and, when I hear messages of, love thy children and inclusivity, I see organizations that don't necessarily represent those values.
Yeah.
Churches that, outwardly ban, people who are in same-sex relationships or, practicing, find themselves in a different orientation than what they were born in, and, where that, God's message is a lot about inclusivity and loving your neighbor, but yet if those people are ostracized, they're not included in your church, how do you reconcile that?
Yeah.
I do this exercise where I ask the students to think about something that one of their most important accomplishments or something that they're most proud of in their life.
Mm-hmm.
And then I ask them to now think about it. I'll use myself for an example. Okay, but becoming a police officer. What if I was born disabled? So the one thing that I think that is very important to me, if I was born a little bit different, how easy would it have been for me to become what I am today? Or what if I'm born a person of color, and the likelihood that I'm going to get stopped and potentially have a criminal record, in my youth, does that make it harder for me to become a police officer now? I forget the exact ones because I use a website to do it, but and it randomizes. The website does a different thing for every student, but you input, what's this important thing in your life or accomplishment or something that you're proud of, and then it throws you and puts you in a different, position, would you have met, maybe it's, one of your biggest accomplishment is just, being married to your wife and your family, but it's like, there are some things that could have happened earlier in your life that would have prevented you from ever meeting that person.
I respect people's opinion, but it don't mean I have to agree with your opinion.
Okay.
And I'm not gonna argue about it. It isn't gonna make no sense about arguing about it because what you feel or think, and you got your mindset on it. I don't care how much we sit here and talk about it, you're still not gonna change your mind. Period.
Yeah.
So that's it. Blow it away.
What is your definition of the word patriot? What does that mean to you?
Yeah, that was an interesting question, I thought, when I read it in there, because the first thing that obviously came to mind, this may sound silly to you, but when I read the question, the first thing that came to mind to me was the movie The Patriot.
Okay.
Mel Gibson's in it. It's colonial times in the United States, and the colonies revolting against Great Britain or England. So I guess, my instinct or my natural thought of patriotism is kind of love for country and willing to defend the values that, you think it represents.
Well, you see some homes, tons of the American flag out there, seeing vehicles, license plate with the flag, bumper stickers and whatnot. And I just got to thinking, like, there are some people that really care about this country, willing to give their life for the country, but they just don't showcase it like that.
Right. Yeah, I think some people sometimes think that the absence of those types of things means that you're not patriotic. I mean, I don't think that necessarily has to be the case. Just
Okay.
like you mentioned, just like without getting too academic here or religious, I mean, I believe that there are many people of faith out there that are, believe in Christianity or, some religion, but that doesn't mean that they necessarily go to church every Sunday. And the fact that they don't go to church doesn't mean that they are a person of faith or a believer in God. dedicated to professional service, and, I mentioned that a big part of that is treating everybody with dignity and respect and fairly. And when I talk about respect too, you just mentioned it, how you said you always try to talk respectfully to, the officer when you've been stopped, And when I was a young cop, and I think this was probably a norm in law enforcement around the country, that I remember being taught when I was young on the job that you show people the respect that they show you. So i.e., you're respectful, so therefore I'll be respectful. But if you're not respectful, or I view or I interpret you as not being respectful, then that's apparently giving me justification to be a dick or to be condescending or rude or treat you in an unfair way. And I tell our officers, I go, the definition of respect that we need to have in this profession is treating people with dignity and respect in the face of disrespect. And that might mean I expect you to treat people with dignity and respect, whether they've sworn at you, called you names, spit at you, assaulted you, and then you made an arrest. It's still, we need to come back around to that, treating people with respect and dignity.
Yep.
Average traffic stop, and say it's between a white officer and a person of color.
Mm-hmm.
We talked about earlier, how sometimes we focus so much on our differences. It's like, why don't we try to look at some of the things that we have in common on that interaction? I mean, you as the driver, you want to survive that traffic stop. You want to be able to be on your way and go on your way and feel like you've been treated fairly. The officer wants to, generally the same things. I mean, they want to go home to their family or whatnot afterwards. They don't want to be assaulted or so on. I mean, sometimes we just have to have better conversations with each other to understand where we're coming from. A bit of awareness of where both sides are too. If more and more officers, saw something like that, and have an understanding of, why some members of communities of color may be distrustful of the police or have greater anxiety or fear on a traffic stop, and thinking of, that little dialogue, and maybe you can recognize some things that allow you to, use that emotional intelligence and say, hey, I see that, this stop is, really causing a lot of anxiety for you, and, I understand it can be scary being stopped by the police, but I want you to know that, you're safe and everything's gonna be okay here,
Yeah.
To just use some of your communication skills to calm some people down, and recognizing a little bit more of an understanding of why they may be acting the way they are, and that it, they're not fidgety or acting funny because they're a criminal or they're trying to hide something in their car, that it may be something like that.
On this arts and culture thing all the time, it is human beings trying to make sense of this and hold up whatever is this love energy.
Right.
And
You could just call it love.
We don't even know what it really, it's different for each one of us because we each see and hear and feel it in our own unique way, but there is a bell, you hear, whatever the bell is that goes off in your head is not that different than the bell that goes off in my head and your head when it's the real deal.
That's right.
And
it's
when
recognized.
we all hear that sort of same sort of tone of this is the real deal. And, I think that's what we're striving to hold up for people is
This
we're
makes
right
life
here.
worth living.
This makes
This
life
is
worth
worth
living,
knowing.
and we're in
Having
this place
this,
where
right?
it's pretty easy to see and hear and feel it. And so, we kind of have a special job because we're in this precious place, and there's something that the Mother Earth is trying to tell us that we can hear here more. It's almost like the veil is a little thinner here.
So I just believe in doing just what you think is right and what is sensible.
Okay.
Actually, I'm not going to tell you how to do it. I'm not going to tell you when to do it. But I may tell you, hey, respect one another. That's all I want.
What is the one message that you want to pass on to younger generations?
Well, I think kind of what we've talked about, that in God's point of view, all men, all women are created equal, and they're all loved by God, and they all deserve an equal place, an equal footing, equal place in our society, equal rights. I mean, even the struggle for voting rights, it's amazing to think how long the blacks had to fight for that. So just that our hope is that everyone can be accepted, you know, for their own value, for how they work and their work ethic, their attitude, and, you know, how they present themselves.
Yeah. Well, you know, obviously I want all of our future generations, I have children of my own, to, you know, grow up in a country that everybody's treated equally and fair with dignity and respect. You know, I don't know if this will answer your question or not, but, you know, during the George Floyd incident, when that was first breaking in the news, and I watch the national news a lot, and I have two kids, 11 and a 16-year-old, and I didn't want them to think, well, Dad's a police officer, so whatever the police do must be right. You know, so as this was playing out on the news, I pulled it, you know, aside after it was done to have a discussion and say, hey, you know, just because I'm a cop doesn't mean that all cops, you know, are right and are always behaving properly. And, you know, and I go, this is an example of that. I go, you know, that's something your dad would never do, and I'm telling you what you're seeing is wrong. You know, so I don't know how that ties in, but I mean, that's, you know, that's what I want my kids to know, you know, is that everybody needs to be treated, you know, fairly and equally with dignity and respect, and that incident was a very shocking example of that not happening, and to also, you know, kind of challenge that, you know, you might be thinking that it's all okay because Dad's a cop and the cops must be doing what's right, but you gotta use your own critical thinking and look at these things, and, you know, when something's wrong, you gotta call it out. Not to be a bystander. You know, that if you see or hear injustices, do something about it, you know, and there's different ways that you can do that, but grow up in a world where, you know, there's peace and they're safe in their, you know, personal safety and belongings, and that they can get a good education and get good jobs and raise families or accomplish whatever their dreams are. And that same, but I also want them to know that everybody should have that same opportunity, not just them.
If there was one thing that you want to tell to, could be young people, old people, society at all, what would it be?
Right now, I would say, be yourself.
Yeah.
Don't be nobody else. Say, honor your own goals and make sure that they're the best that you can bring forth. Honor each and every individual and treat them just like they're human, and love them just like God said. Love them all. So I just want to love everyone, and I know everyone is not going to love me, which is fine. I can deal with that. Doesn't bother me.
Yeah.
And like I jokingly say, I don't have to sleep with you at night. Whatever your feelings may be, they are your own chosen words or whatever. But you don't have to love me in order for you to sleep with me. You can sleep in your bed and I can still sleep in mine and still love you. I'm good with you.
All right. Well, thanks for that.
Steve, I'm just, hey, and if it's something that I may say here or there, and if it doesn't make sense to you, all you got to do is, all right, Jim, why do you feel that way? I may have to think about it for a while, and then I can tell you.
I think one of the things that happens here, and maybe you felt this at Cookin', is the, when the music is really going and people are really into it in this tiny little space in this house, every now and then I will see a couple who really have never been exposed to much interracial stuff, and their basic experiences, we're not having as much fun as they are.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah,
and
right.
there's this
Yeah,
very
it-
simple recognition that will happen on their faces of, I'm really not
Yeah.
having that great a life. They're
Right,
having
yeah,
a
this
much
is so
greater
much fun.
life.
It's
You
much
know,
more
and-
fun to live like these people are living.
And what are they doing?
You know?
They're just being loose, goofy, human, happy people, and
Right.
that pretty much transcends who's got money, who doesn't, who's
Right.
got what color skin. It's like who vibes with who.
Right.
And it's a whole different, happier equation. And that is my little way of illustrating the point of arts and culture, is you are creating a picture for people of the future. There is this very lovely thing awaiting us.
Yeah,
The
that it's not to
beloved
be afraid,
community.
you don't have to be afraid of
In
it.
fact, you are
Love it, it's gonna be so much better for you.
so much happier if we get there. And so that's the message of arts and culture, is you can show it to people in poems, moments of music, moments of community, where you just say, yeah, you're right, we're having more fun.